mentioned, that is examining drag performers in modern cinema and also the gendered performance of the early modern stage. So this is just a very small part of a much larger piece that I'm more than happy to provide to anyone who is interested in. But this takes the standard format of my research, which is taking texts from political and critical theory and applying them to technological mediations of modern performance. So the specific text that I am reading today is actually the Globe's 2014 production of Antony and Cleopatra that is mediated through the simulcast technologies that are now available to us, that really bring people from across the world right into the audience of the Globe. Now, I must say right at the beginning that when I wrote this piece, I had no intention of it being presented at the Globe Shakespearean Conference. So I'm in that slightly awkward positionality right now where it's almost like you're talking about someone behind their back and they come around the corner. So I invite you to embrace that awkwardness and ambiguity with me today. So essentially, what I argue through this intersection of text is that a transformation occurs when ambiguity is acknowledged, such that a reorganized reconfiguration of the strict male-female binaries of phallocentric schemes of objectification through gazing occurs even within the confines of cis heteropatriarchal societies. However, this transformation cannot occur without the help of Beauvoir's theoretical example, the political text that I'm using to read this production. Although the foundation for such ambiguity does exist within Shakespeare's original text, I argue that we can't notice that ambiguity without Beauvoir, particularly without Beauvoir and the modern technologies that we have for dissemination. Now, that being said, as I mentioned, that this is the standard format for my research, so this allows me to examine such various performative spaces such as modern drag performance through the lines of objection or onticide, but also reading the ontologies and epistemologies that are erected within, well, early modern English performance through the ambiguity of Antony and Cleopatra. Now, Beauvoir and the Bard, why are we bringing these two great writers into conversation with each other? One was an early modern English playwright, the other, a French existentialist philosopher who in many ways started the second wave of feminism. Well, I believe at this critical juncture there is that conversation that can be created to acknowledge previously unnoticed modalities. Now, perhaps her greatest work is The Second Sex, or at least most well known, I should say. And from that work, we have the great quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes woman." Now, I want to specifically situate this conversation, my presentation today, in the majority of the theoretical background of this larger piece, because, of course, in the interest of time, we're only able to look at a very small portion. So, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, and this theory actually underwrites much of modern gender theory. We see this underwriting Butler's idea of the performativity of gender, of social constructions of gender. However, although that is situated at the very center of my work, I'm actually utilizing a different one of her pieces, that being the philosophical treatise, The Ethics of Ambiguity. And in this, Beauvoir is basically arguing for the relationship of the self to the larger societal constructs that we exist in. So she's examining the situation of the self versus other dichotomy, the subject versus object. Now, what exactly do I mean by this? So this is actually at the foundation of our major Western conceptualizations of self. We see ourselves both within our singular conceptualization. I am not other, I am self. I conceptualize myself in that way. However, what Beauvoir is arguing is that there's actually an ambiguity here, a way in which we are both self and other. So that completely unravels entire Western modes of ontology. It completely is antithetical to how we conceptualize ourselves within the Western socio-political construct. So how is this even possible? Well, as mentioned, I conceptualize myself in the self as I am standing here. But you also conceptualize me in your own understanding. So I'm existing as other to all of you, at the same concurrent moment that I'm existing as self to myself. So there's this ambiguity here, a renegotiation of those boundaries. And that brings us to exactly why I'm using this text to read Antony and Cleopatra. So it's actually bringing in film theory. So with that self versus other dichotomy, that is the foundation of Western systems of gazing, we see a reconstruction that can occur. So basically, I'm reading a text that is mediated through cinema, through the recorded performance. So we're using film theory to read this ambiguity because gazing within the Western construct is inherently hierarchical. It's used to reinforce this binary, it's to reinforce the hierarchies there. And as Gurr talks about in Staging at the Globe, we now think in the cinematic image. So the ambiguity is needed to unravel the gazing that we participate in within Western society that is based on these inherent hierarchies. So that brings me to the male gaze, and I promise this is the last leg of my theoretical foundation that I'm going to force you to go upon with me. So the male gaze is the basis of feminist film theory, and by Laura Mulvey, it basically argues that the gaze of the cinema is based around 3 explicitly male looks or gazes. The first is the figure within the cinema, which is coded along heteronormative modes of desire. The second is the gaze of the camera, which presumes a male spectator. And the third is the audience, which is necessitated along heteronormative modes of desire in the Western cinematic construct to be participating within these two previous male gazes. So they're working together in order to create this system of gazing that is inherently male and inherently objectifying the feminized figure. However, that gaze is not necessarily male in terms of you do not have to be biologically or gender identified as a man in order to activate it. But you do have to participate in masculine forms of activating that power and that positionality. So much like modern feminism in many ways is just interested in getting women into positions of power without actually reconstructing the systems of power in and of themselves. This system of gazing that proposes that, yes, a woman can occupy this masculinized position of power without actually reconstructing the system of power in and of itself is possible. But I argue that that's not actually creating any new subversive forms of gazing, but rather just putting the same systems of power in drag. So to briefly summarize where we are in this theoretical juncture is Beauvoir's example, her theory of ambiguity, which allows us to be both self and other, deconstructs this tension, deconstructs this boundary, and renegotiates the boundary of the inherently hierarchical systems of gazing. Film theory is important here because it allows us to examine this tension. So what I argue is that within the Globe's production, within original practice productions, that we're actually able to unravel this entire system of gazing. No, we do not have to be using the male gaze. No, we do not have to be using that same system of power with a female in that position at the top of the hierarchy. But we can actually create an entirely new system of gazing through original practice performance productions because the spectacle can look back at the spectator. So we can embrace that ambiguity. We can embrace that breakdown of the self versus other when the spectacle looks back. Now, normally at this juncture, I would be going into an examination of exactly what original practice performance conventions are. However, I do trust, considering the venue, that we are fairly confident and familiar with those conventions. So in brief, I just want to cite 2 specific ones that are particularly important for my theorizing. So the first is the fact that they use universal lighting at the Globe, the fact that they do it with the lights on, to steal the phrase. And as such, you are able to literally see the audience looking back. Second is the technological innovation that is provided by the fact that we have these recorded performances utilized at the Globe. And that's not necessarily a tenet of original practice, but it is utilized at the Globe. And the fact that through these recorded productions, the audience also becomes part of the spectacle, that you become part of what is looking back at the spectator. Thank you. It completely unravels that system of gazing that is based on those inherent hierarchies. And the final aspect, which is a tenet, of course, of original practice, is that extensive audience interaction. So not only through that recorded performance, that technological innovation, are you able to conjoin the spectacle and the spectator through that gaze, but you're also able to actually see that occurring, actually interact with the performers. That creates a situation where we are not looking at possession, but rather a mutual gaze. Through the onstage spectacle, they're not merely looked at, they're not merely objectified through that masculine gaze, or feminine gaze, which is really just the masculine gaze in drag, but rather this mutual alternative. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. And that brings us to some specific moments that I want to cite where the mutual gaze is enacted. So in the Globe's 2014 production, they actually add this musical interlude at the beginning. And through this moment, many of the characters interact with the audience, they dance through the audience, they involve the audience with the onstage spectacle. With recorded performance, we are able to see that throughout the world. So one particular moment I found interesting is when one of her handmaidens actually interacts with the audience, goes into the audience, and flips her hair onto an audience member. This completely unravels any sort of objectification of that on-screen image. How can you deny the humanity of another individual who is literally interacting with you? There's no possible way to engage with such objectification and such singular modes of gazing when that gaze is being returned. And not only is that gaze being returned, but there's an actual interaction with that spectacle. So that's the first moment that's particularly significant. So rather than increasing her dehumanization, she's becoming a spectacle as well as a spectator. This also occurs when Cleopatra's first entrance, one of her significant entrances, she runs down stage, welcoming the audience's view, engaging in a very intimate moment as she's wrapped in a bedsheet. So this has also moved beyond the male-female dichotomy because of the way that these characters are costumed. Frequently, we see these two characters, Antony and Cleopatra, being confused for each other in the text. So there is the existence of this possibility of ambiguity in the text itself. Through performative choices, it's enacted. Thank you. So they're transgressing those specific gendered boundaries, embracing modes of production that allow us to embrace cross-gendered costuming in order to really heighten that awareness of the ambiguity that's being enacted. So to conclude, in this space, ambiguity is able to create a site for alternatives to the male, female, and self-other dichotomies, even within the confines of patriarchal culture. The couple are both self and other. One half of the pair is not intrinsically subordinate to the other. Both are performing roles for the other, existing to the other's perception, and becoming an object even as they are able to retain their subjectivity. Again, this is specifically created within the tenets of original practice productions because it allows us to have those lights on as well as audience interaction. You can't deny the subjectivity of someone who's literally interacting with you. They can no longer be just that objectified image. So ultimately, I argue that that is the true ambiguity of Antony and Cleopatra, and it opens some truly fascinating potentialities and sites for reconfiguring the ontologies of the Western cinematic structure. Thank you very much.